They laughed. That's the first thing I remember, the laughter, not the polite kind either. I'm talking about the "you must be insane" kind of laughter that echoes across a quiet neighborhood and makes you want to crawl under a rock. I had just bought a shack by the lake. For $5. Yes, $5. A shack that looked like it had survived every hurricane in history, and then some, with a roof that leaned at an angle, that geometry, and a dock that wobbled like it was auditioning for America's funniest home structures. I remember my neighbor, a man named Bob with a perfectly manicured lawn and a glued to his wrist, walking past as I was unloading the last box of supplies. He squinted at the shack, then at me. $5, he said, shaking his head. Are you serious? Yes, I'm serious, I replied, struggling not to laugh. I think it has potential. Bob didn't get it, neither did anyone else. The HOA, which had clearly been formed to micromanage every blade of grass in the community, sent their first letter a week later. It arrived with a thin, smug sense of superiority, the kind of superiority only a group of people obsessed with lawn heights and paint colors can muster. Dear homeowner, it began, dripping with sarcasm, we notice your structure at 42 Lane. Please ensure it does not further decrease property values. I read the letter twice, then laughed out loud. I'm not proud of the snort I made, but there it is. I actually taped it to my fridge because it was hilarious. Here was a group of people who clearly spent too much time monitoring other people's shutters, trying to lecture me about my $5 shack. But the humor didn't last, because that letter was only the beginning. The laughter from neighbors turned into whispers. Is he actually living there? They ask. Will he be forced to sell? And then the subtle glances started, the kind that say, we're watching you. I realized the HOA didn't just want me to tidy up the shack. They wanted control. They wanted me to conform. And I'm the kind of person who gets very stubborn when people try to tell me what I can or cannot do. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me, not yet. That night I sat on the crooked dock, dangling my feet over the water, imagining the possibilities. The shack had character, sure, it had more character than half the cookie-cutter houses in the neighborhood, but it was raw potential waiting to be tapped, and tap it I would, slowly, secretly, almost mischievously. I started sketching out plans in my notebook. A tiny deck here, a small pier there, a little floating platform for evening sunsets, and maybe, just maybe, a miniature hot tub that would make the neighbors' perfectly landscaped lawns look boring. I smiled. The shack was going to surprise them. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee on the dock, I noticed a figure in the distance. One of the HOA board members, clipboard in hand, packing and muttering like he was on a secret mission. I waved. He didn't wave back, he just stared. I wondered what ridiculous violation he'd think up next. That dock is slightly off-center, maybe. Or the color of your shack is making the water feel unsafe. It was almost comical, almost. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about my shack. It was about pride, about power, about control. And they were already gearing up for a battle they didn't even know they were walking into. I leaned back on my chair, squinting at the lake. I could feel it, the quiet tension in the air, the kind that tells you that everything is about to change. My shack was just $5, sure, but sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest surprises. And little did they know, my $5 shack wasn't just a shack. It was a ticking time bomb of potential. And when the right moment came, it was going to explode in the one place the HOA never expected, right under their noses. They mocked me, they laughed, they sent letters dripping with sarcasm, but they had no idea that $5 shack was about to cost them millions. At first, I tried to ignore the HOA. I really did. I thought, they're just bureaucrats with too much free time, let them fume. But ignoring them only made things worse. Letters started arriving almost daily, each one dripping with more sarcasm and passive-aggressive warnings than the last. Your dock is disproportionately long compared to other properties, one letter complained. The color of your siding may cause visual discomfort to neighbors, read another. And my personal favorite, grass must be trimmed to within 1 inch of our community standard or fines will be applied. I stared at that one for a while. 1 inch, I muttered to myself. Are they measuring the grass with calipers? I began to notice that the laughter from neighbors wasn't entirely polite anymore. It was the kind of curious, whispering attention that made you feel like the main character in a reality TV show. I could almost hear the HOA's mental soundtrack in the background. Mission, destroy shack. Then came the first inspector visit. A man in a crisp white shirt, pressed slacks, and an expression that screamed, I'm more important than you, arrived at my shack with a clipboard in hand. He inspected every corner, walked around the wobbly dock, squinted at the uneven siding, and even crouched suspiciously to measure the angle of my roof. I couldn't help myself. I waved cheerfully and said, "Hey there, beautiful day, huh?" He didn't respond, not even a twitch. I swear he might have been a robot programmed for nitpicking. I realized then that the HOA wasn't just a nuisance. They were gearing up for a full-scale attack. Their letters, their inspections, their judgmental stares from across the lake, it was all part of the plan, and I was their target. But here's the thing, I thrive under chaos. If anyone thinks I'll sit quietly while people bully me over a shack I bought for the price of a fancy coffee, they clearly don't know me. I began thinking strategically. Every complaint they sent became fuel for my fire. Every absurd demand was a reminder that I had to fight smarter, not just harder. And fight I would. The next week, I got a particularly nasty letter. They were now threatening fines, hundreds of dollars a day if I didn't bring the shack into compliance immediately. My favorite part? They had included a compliance checklist with absurd items like ensure no personal items are visible from the street and dock must not reflect sunlight directly onto neighboring properties. I couldn't stop laughing. Who knew a $5 shack could inspire so much bureaucratic creativity? But while I laughed, I also felt a twinge of tension. These people weren't just annoyed, they were desperate. And desperate people often do stupid things. I decided it was time to play a little game. I started documenting everything, every letter, every visit, every ridiculous comment from the HOA. I even started secretly taking photos of their inspectors measuring the dock with rulers, crouching to measure angles, and frowning at sunlight reflections. This would come in handy later. Oh yes, it would come in handy. Meanwhile, neighbors started whispering again, but this time with curiosity instead of mockery. "Do you think he's going to lose it?" they ask. Others leaned in closer. "Maybe he'll actually fix it up, make it livable." They had no idea what I had in mind. The tension kept building. Every time I walked outside, I could feel eyes on me. Every HOA letter that arrived felt like a ticking clock, counting down to some inevitable confrontation. And I knew one thing for certain, the shack was small, cheap, and mocked, but I wasn't going to let them win, not even close. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lake shimmered in gold and orange, I found a legal notice slipped under my door. My heart skipped a beat. This one wasn't funny. This one wasn't sarcastic. This one had official seals, legal jargon, and a tone that said in no uncertain terms, "We want your property." I held it in my hands, staring at the words. My $5 shack, my tiny dream by the lake, they wanted it. They had escalated from mockery to actual legal threats, and for the first time I felt the real weight of the battle ahead. But I also felt something else, excitement, because if they thought this little shack was going down without a fight, they had another thing coming. They weren't just mocking me anymore, they were coming for the shack, and I was ready to show them that the $5 shack was about to become the hardest thing in the neighborhood to take. I stared at that legal notice on my kitchen counter like it was some kind of challenge. The HOA wanted to take my $5 shack. My neighbors were whispering behind curtains. And somehow this tiny, falling apart little building had become the epicenter of community drama. I made a decision right then. I wasn't going to fold, not now, not ever. Instead, I hatched a plan, an upgrade plan so sneaky, so clever, and honestly so ridiculous that the HOA would never see it coming. The first step was to work quietly. I didn't want their inspectors peering over my shoulder or another passive-aggressive letter dripping with mockery arriving in my mailbox. I started in secret, one plank of wood at a time, one paintbrush stroke at a time. I transformed that shack slowly but surely. I added a tiny floating deck that jutted over the lake, just enough for sunsets and morning coffee. I installed a small hot tub. I call it Cozy Chaos, and yes, it bubbled and glowed at night, making the shack look like some sort of magical fairy tale on the water. I also worked on the interior. The shack may have been tiny, but I had big ideas. Reclaimed wood, clever shelving, string lights, and just the right touch of color. I wanted it to feel like a retreat, a tiny slice of paradise that would make the neighbors stop their whispering and stare in awe. All the while, the HOA continued their campaign. Inspectors showed up unannounced, measuring, judging, frowning. One morning, I caught a guy crouching by the dock with a measuring tape and a look of pure horror on his face. I waved at him. "Hi there, beautiful day to nitpick, huh?" He just blinked at me and shuffled away. I could hear him muttering to himself, "This shack, it's defying the rules somehow." Their obsession only fueled me. Every letter, every threat, every inspection became part of my inspiration. I turned what they thought was a weakness, the shack's absurdity, into a secret weapon. The upgrades were almost comical in their over-the-top charm. A tiny fire pit here, solar lanterns there, a hammock stretched between two stubbornly crooked trees. Neighbors started to notice. At first, it was cautious glances, then curious whispers, "Is he serious? That shack actually looks nice." And that's when I knew I was on the right track. The shack was quietly transforming from an eyesore into something remarkable, something the HOA could never have imagined. But it wasn't just about making it look good, it was about setting the stage for what was coming next. I needed proof, evidence, a way to show everyone that the shack was mine, legally and rightfully, and that the HOA had no power over it. I documented everything: permits, receipts, before and after photos. Every upgrade, every repair, every improvement was carefully recorded. Then came the fun part, the aesthetics. I added quirky touches that made people stop and stare: a tiny dock extension shaped like a crescent moon, lights that twinkled across the water like fireflies, a miniature garden with flowers that glowed under the moonlight. It was ridiculous, yes, but in the best way possible. By the time I was halfway through the upgrades, the neighborhood had begun to murmur. Even the HOA started sending less smug letters and more urgent ones, like they were noticing something, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Something was happening at 42 Lane and they didn't understand it. I worked late into the nights, the lake reflecting the moonlight on my tiny empire. Every plank I nailed, every bulb I installed felt like another step in a secret dance of revenge and triumph. The shack wasn't just a building anymore, it was becoming a symbol. A symbol that no amount of mockery, no stack of legal threats could stop me. And then, as I stepped back one evening to admire the floating deck, the glowing lights, the little oasis I had created, I realized something. The shack wasn't just upgraded. It was about to be unbelievably valuable. The kind of value that the HOA had never dreamed of in their wildest nightmares. While they were busy obsessing over inches of grass and paint colors, I had quietly turned the $5 shack into a masterpiece. And soon, the HOA would realize, too late, that they had underestimated me badly. It started with a rumor. One of the neighbors whispered to another, who whispered to someone at the HOA meeting, who told Bob's, you remember Bob's, the guy, and before long, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. "Did you hear the shack got appraised?" "Appraised for what, $500? "No, 5 million. I swear you could heard the collective gasp echo across the lake. The same people who once laughed at me were suddenly frozen, their smiles twitching into disbelief. It began when a real estate agent who specialized in unique lakefront properties reached out. She said, "I've seen your place online. Would you be open to an appraisal? There's interest." Interest in my shack? I thought it was a prank, but I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. When the appraiser came by, I watched him walk around the property, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise to something I can only describe as awe. By the end of the day, he looked at me shaking his head. "You're sitting on a you-know-that? Lakefront property, perfect angle for sunrise and sunset, eco-friendly upgrades, unique architecture, this is one of a kind." When the number came back, $5 million, I nearly dropped my coffee. I read it twice, 3 times, even checked if there was a decimal error. Nope, $5 million. My $5 shack had somehow become one of the most valuable properties in the county. I couldn't stop laughing. I laughed until my sides hurt. But the laughter didn't last long, because once the HOA found out, the real storm began. Within days, the letters returned, but this time they weren't smug, they were frantic. "We need to schedule an emergency review of your property's compliance with community standards. Please cease all renovations until the board can evaluate your situation. Failure to cooperate may result in legal consequences." I read them out loud to myself like dramatic monologues. I even gave the HOA president an imaginary villain voice when I read his signature. Failure to cooperate may result in legal consequences. But beneath the humor, I knew what they were really doing. They wanted leverage. My property's new value scared them. If I sold, it would change the entire neighborhood's dynamic. My shack was now worth more than every HOA member's home combined, and that made them furious. I noticed the shift almost immediately. Suddenly, the board members who used to ignore me were driving by slowly, pretending to check for safety issues. The same inspector who once measured my dock like it was a crime scene now took photos from across the street. The HOA president even tried to stop me at the mailbox one morning, plastering on a fake smile. "Morning," he said, his voice tight. "Lovely structure you've got there. We were hoping you might consider donating part of your property to the community." I raised an eyebrow. "Donating as in giving it to you?" "Well," he said, adjusting his tie nervously, "it would improve the neighborhood aesthetic. Bring everyone together." I smiled. "You mean the aesthetic you said was lowering property values?" He blinked. I don't think he expected me to remember that part. He muttered something about community harmony and shuffled away, probably to plot his next move. Behind the humor, though, I could feel it, the tension thickening. This wasn't just petty HOA business anymore. They wanted what I had, and they weren't going to stop until they either took it or destroyed it. Neighbors who once laughed now looked nervous. Some whispered congratulations, others avoided eye contact, terrified the HOA would target them next. The atmosphere around the lake changed. It felt like standing in the eye of a brewing storm. That night, I sat on my glowing dock, looking at the reflection of my lights dancing on the water. My shack, my tiny $5 dream, had become a beacon, a symbol, and maybe, just maybe, a problem too big for the HOA to handle quietly. But I wasn't scared. I'd already fought them once. I could do it again. What I didn't realize, though, was how far they were willing to go. The next move they made wasn't just petty, it was personal. The HOA wasn't just angry, they were desperate. And desperate people, I was about to learn, can be dangerous. I'll be honest, after weeks of construction noise, late-night strategy calls, and Karen's constant harassment, I was starting to lose patience. My once quiet lake shack was now a construction zone of drills, backhoes, and work crews. But what none of the neighbors knew was what was really being built. See, when I got those old blueprints from the county, I didn't just find old paper. I found the original permits showing my property had grandfathered rights to the entire strip of shoreline. Not just my dock, the shoreline. And since the HOA's fancy park and community dock were technically built over it without updating county records, I now had the legal right to challenge their use of it. That's when things got interesting. One morning, as I was out by the dock checking the waterline, a sleek black SUV pulled up. Out stepped Karen, of course, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a navy suit followed her out, holding a folder like he was about to deliver the State of the Union. "Mr. Lake Shack," Karen said, her tone syrupy sweet, "we'd like to make you an offer." I raised an eyebrow. An offer? What is this, Shark Tank? The man smiled tightly. "Mr. Collins, my client, the Homeowners Association would like to purchase your property for, let's say, $150,000. I blinked. "You're offering me six figures for a shack you all said was an eyesore." Karen smiled, clearly thinking she'd just outplayed me. "It's a generous offer, especially considering the, state of your property." I crossed my arms, "And if I don't take it?" Her smile dropped faster than my jaw. "The day I found the gold in my attic. Then we'll have to consider legal action. Your construction might be in violation of HOA codes, and the board won't allow unapproved shoreline development." There it was, the threat. I didn't flinch. "Karen, that's adorable, but you might want to check with the county before you come for me again. I'm not in your HOA, never was, never will be." The man's smile faltered. Karen's cheeks flushed. She turned on her heel and stormed back to the SUV. But I wasn't done yet. That night, I sent out invitations to the HOA members, the county inspector, and even the local news. I told them to come down to the lake Friday morning for a little reveal. When Friday came, Karen arrived first, wearing her pink blazer like a general leading her troops. A small crowd gathered: neighbors, board members, a news reporter, even the same county officer who'd given me those blueprints. Karen rolled her eyes as I stepped forward with a grin. "Everyone," I said, "I'd like to introduce you to the new and improved Lake Shack." The crowd turned as the tarp came off, and the gasps were priceless. My shack wasn't just renovated, it had been transformed. The once peeling wood siding was replaced with modern cedar planks. Solar panels lined the roof. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the water. A sleek wraparound deck glistened with reclaimed lakewood. And the kicker, the old dock had been extended right up to where the HOA's community dock started. Karen's jaw dropped. "You can't, this violates." The county officer interrupted. "Actually, Mrs. Daniels, he can. According to these original permits, his property line extends through this section of the shoreline. You, however, appear to have built over it without authorization." Her face went pale, the crowd murmured. Then I pulled out my own folder. Since the HOA enjoyed calling my place an eyesore, I thought I'd give it some real value. The new property appraisal came in yesterday. I opened the page for everyone to see. Estimated worth $5 million. Karen staggered like she'd just seen a ghost. $5 million. "Yeah," I said, smirking. "Turns out when you mix history, location, and a little patience, you can turn a $5 shack into the most valuable property on the lake." The reporter's camera flashed, neighbors whispered, Karen looked ready to explode. But I wasn't done. Here the fun part, I continued. Since the HOA's dock sits partly on my land, I'll need to discuss usage rights, or, I could just fence it off. Karen's composure shattered. You wouldn't dare. Oh, I would, I said, stepping closer, because this time I've got the paperwork to back me up. As she stormed off, the reporter caught every word of her angry rant. By the next day, the headline read, "Man turns eyesore shack into $5 million lakeside estate, HOA furious over land dispute." The views climbed fast. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. But behind the cameras and smiles, I knew one thing: Karen wasn't going to let this go quietly. Not after I embarrassed her in front of the whole neighborhood. And I was right. Because 3 days later, I got a certified letter in the mail, one with the HOA's seal stamped right across the front. It wasn't an offer this time. It was a lawsuit. 3 days after the reveal, the certified letter arrived. I held it in my hands like it was a ticking bomb. The HOA wasn't sending an offer this time. No, this time they were sending a full-blown lawsuit. My $5 shack, my little lakeside dream that had just become the talk of the county, was under attack. The letter was long, filled with legal jargon, citations of obscure HOA codes, and dramatic threats of court action. My favorite part? The repeated emphasis on how my unauthorized renovations and shoreline encroachments were apparently a catastrophic violation of every principle the HOA stood for. I read it twice. I laughed, then I read it again. And yes, I framed it. But beneath the humor, there was a serious problem. These people had money, lawyers, and the kind of obsession that can make you nervous even when you're right. They weren't bluffing. They wanted my property, and they were willing to drag me through legal hell to get it. So I did what any sane, stubborn person would do. I planned my counterattack. Step 1, knowledge. I dug through every HOA bylaw, every county record, every document I could find about my property. It was tedious, but I found the loopholes hiding in plain sight. For example, their community dock encroached on my land according to the original permits I'd discovered months ago, and any attempt to claim damages would be on their side, not mine. Step 2, documentation. I photographed every inch of my shack, the shoreline, the dock, the landscaping, all the renovations, every detail. I even recorded timestamps of when work was done. I wanted to build a digital fortress that no lawyer could knock down. Step 3, allies. Some neighbors quietly admired my stubbornness. Others had been quietly observing the HOA's overreach for years. I reached out to a few, explaining the situation carefully. Soon, I had witnesses, sworn statements, and even some local experts ready to testify if needed. Step 4, humor as strategy. I realized that if I could make the HOA's attempts look ridiculous, public opinion would swing in my favor. Their letters, once menacing, were now opportunities. Every absurd complaint, dock length, siding color, sunlight reflection, was something I could use in court or in front of the media to show how petty and overreaching they had become. The real fun began when I drafted my response. I didn't just hire a lawyer, I became my own strategist. I outlined how each of their claims could be turned on its head. Their threat of fines, void because I had documentation proving every improvement was legal. Their complaint about shoreline encroachment, reversed because I legally owned the land and their dock partially sat on it without permits. Then came the media angle. I didn't want to just win, I wanted them embarrassed. I called a local journalist, hinted at the story. Man turns $5 shack into $5 million lakeside property. HOA claims it's illegal, watch them scramble. The journalist loved it. The story went viral overnight. Suddenly, the HOA was under pressure, not just from me but from the public. Their petty tactics now looked foolish in the light of social media scrutiny. By now, Karen was packing her office like a cat stuck in a rainstorm. The letters stopped coming for a day or two, then resumed, but this time carefully worded, almost nervous. She realized I wasn't just stubborn, I was prepared. I spent nights reviewing documents, checking permits, and mentally rehearsing every possible confrontation. I even drew diagrams of the lake, my shack, and the HOA's dock, like a general planning a battle. It was absurd, but effective. The beauty of it all, they didn't realize I was playing chess while they were playing checkers. Every move they made, every threat, every legal maneuver was anticipated. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I had a full strategy ready, not just to defend my shack, but to turn the tables completely. And the best part, Karen had no idea how badly she underestimated me. She thought the shack was a joke, she thought I'd fold, she thought her lawyers and letters could scare me off. She was wrong. That Friday, I walked down to the lake with a calm smile and a folder full of evidence, photos, and legal documents. The board was waiting, confident, smug, ready to intimidate. They didn't know that I wasn't just ready to defend my shack, I was ready to embarrass them publicly. The showdown was about to happen, and this time the HOA would learn exactly what happens when you mess with a stubborn man, a $5 shack, and $5 million worth of principal. The morning of the HOA meeting, I could feel the tension hanging over the lake like a thunderstorm waiting to break. I wasn't nervous, not exactly, I was excited, thrilled even. After all, I had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. My folder of documents weighed more than a small child, but it wasn't the papers that gave me confidence. It was the knowledge that I had every legal, logical, and even public opinion advantage on my side. Karen arrived first, of course, pink blazer pristine, hair in perfect place, clipboard in hand, like she was about to command an army. Behind her, the rest of the HOA board shuffled in, all looking far too serious for a sunny Friday morning. Some gave me pointed glances as if their fury could somehow move mountains, or in this case, steal a lake shack. I walked in smiling, holding my folder like a trophy. "Good morning," I said cheerfully. "Lovely day for a meeting, isn't it?" Karen blinked. "Mr. Collins," she said, voice sharp, "we are here to discuss your property. Your recent renovations are in violation of HOA standards, and we intend to rectify the situation." I nodded, flipping open my folder. "Oh, I must have missed that memo. Let's see, first, we have the original county permits clearly stating the property line extends beyond your dock. Second, documented renovations, all approved and legal. Third, appraisals showing the property's value $5 million. And finally, I held up a stack of photos, evidence of your board's encroachments on my land." The room went quiet, Karen's jaw twitched, and the board members shuffled uneasily. One of them whispered, "Did he include our dock?" I smiled, "Yes, and as it turns out, part of it sits on my property." I let that sink in. "So if you want to continue using it, we'll need to discuss usage rights, or of course, I could close it off entirely." Karen sputtered, "You can't, this is outrageous, we..." "Actually," I interrupted, leaning casually against the table, "I can, and I legally do. Everything here is documented." I tapped the folder for emphasis. "Every plank, every extension, every light, every inch of my shack completely above board. I've anticipated every claim you might make, and your threats are frankly ineffective." I glanced around the room. Neighbors who had shown up to watch the meeting whispered and nodded, some smirking behind their hands. The county officer gave me a small, approving nod. Even the reporter in the corner was typing furiously, knowing this story was about to blow up online. Karen's face turned red. This won't stand. The HOA will take legal action." I laughed, just a short, controlled laugh, enough to make her stumble over her words. "Go ahead, you already tried. And as you can see," I gestured to the folder again, "the paperwork, permits, and evidence are all in my favor. You really shouldn't have underestimated me or my $5 shack." One by one, I went through every claim they had made. The dock lengths, the paint, the hot tub, the shoreline. Every argument fell apart under simple facts, logical reasoning, and legal documentation. Karen's hands trembled as she flipped through her notes, looking for a loophole, a technicality, anything. She found nothing. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The board members who had once glared at me now avoided eye contact. Karen, ever dramatic, stormed out, muttering under her breath about appeals, lawyers, and this isn't over. I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. The room was quiet except for the sound of neighbors murmuring in awe. I had done it. The shack, my little $5 joke of a property, was untouchable. I had turned their own obsession against them, exposed their overreach, and done it all without losing my temper or my sense of humor. And then came the twist. One of the county officers cleared his throat. "Mr. Collins," he said, "we also reviewed the HOA's filings. Because of your legal documentation and the encroachments we've observed, the HOA may now be liable for damages on your property. That includes repairs and unauthorized usage fees." The room erupted in gasps. Karen's face went pale, board members whispered frantically. They had thought they were coming for my shack, but the reality was they were the ones at risk now. I smiled quietly to myself, stepping outside to the sunlight reflecting off the lake. My $5 shack had not only survived the HOA's attacks, it had become untouchable legally and publicly. Karen had been defeated in the meeting, but I knew she wasn't finished. There was still one final surprise waiting, and it would make the neighborhood remember this battle forever. After the HOA meeting, the lake felt different. Not quieter exactly, there were still birds, boats, and the gentle lapping of water, but the tension that had hung over my property for months finally lifted. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe, and I did, deeply, slowly, until I realized something funny. The shack, my $5 shack, had officially become a legend. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The local reporter had posted the story online. Man turns $5 shack into $5 million lakeside estate, HOA left red-faced. Views, shares, comments, it was everywhere. I got texts from friends, strangers, and even a few curious neighbors I'd never spoken to. Everyone wanted to see the shack that had become a symbol of stubbornness, creativity, and the audacity to fight back. Meanwhile, Karen had gone quiet, very quiet. I'm sure she was plotting, scheming, and maybe Googling how to reclaim a $5 million shack without looking foolish. But the truth was the HOA had lost. And losing to a $5 shack that looked like $1 million palace now, that was the kind of humiliation that lingered. I spent the day walking around the property, inspecting every corner, every upgrade. The floating deck sparkled in the morning sun. The hot tub hissed softly as steam drifted into the crisp air. The garden glowed faintly with the fairy lights I'd installed, and for a moment I just stood there smiling. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't about proving the HOA wrong. It was about freedom, the ability to take something tiny, overlooked, and dismissed and turn it into something remarkable. My shack had become a symbol not just of property ownership, but of patience, persistence, and a little bit of mischievous genius. Neighbors who had once laughed at me now walked by with respect. Some even waved. Others pretended to look busy, but I knew what they were thinking. That man outsmarted the HOA. It was satisfying, delicious even. And then there was the final twist, the part no one expected. Remember the part of the shoreline that the HOA had encroached on? With the legal documents in hand, I was able to negotiate a small usage fee. Nothing outrageous, just enough to remind them that their mistakes had consequences. The HOA, red-faced and humbled, begrudgingly agreed. It wasn't revenge exactly, it was poetic justice. By the time evening came, I was sitting on my floating deck, watching the sun set over the lake. The water reflected pinks, oranges, and purples like the world itself was celebrating. I poured a glass of wine and leaned back, thinking about how far this had come. From a $5 shack mocked and scorned to a $5 million property that commanded attention, respect, and yes, a little fear from the HOA. I laughed quietly to myself, remembering the first letters, the inspections, the threats. They had thought they were controlling me. They had thought they could bully a man over a tiny piece of property. But in the end, it was they who had lost control. The lake was peaceful, the shack glowed softly in the twilight, and for the first time I felt completely satisfied. The battle had been long, ridiculous, and stressful, but victorious. And the lesson was clear: never underestimate a stubborn man, a small shack, and the power of a little creativity mixed with patience. As night fell, I looked up at the stars, listening to the gentle water against the dock. The shack stood proud, glowing faintly under the moonlight. A $5 shack turned fortress, turned dream home. And no matter what the HOA did next, or how loudly Karen might protest, it was mine, all mine. Not this time, this was the ending. The shack had survived, thrived, and outsmarted every challenge thrown its way. And as I leaned back, sipping my wine and feeling the breeze on my face, I knew one thing: sometimes the smallest things, like a $5 shack, can teach the biggest lessons. And if the HOA ever tries to mess with me again, well, let's just say they'll get a front row seat to in stubbornness. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.